Donald Trump shifting priorities for the U.S. military. The president says he wants to bring American troops home from Syria, even as military planners are preparing to increase the number of U.S. forces there. Now, Mr. Trump says he wants the military to protect the U.S. border with Mexico until a border wall is complete.
We don't have laws. We have catch and release. You catch and then you immediately release, and people come back years later for a court case, except they virtually never come back. So we are preparing for the military to secure our border between Mexico and the United States. We have a meeting on it in a little while with General Mathews and everybody, and I think that it's something we have to do.
Well, Seema Mehta is a political writer for the LA Times, and Peter Mathews is a professor of political science at Cypress College. Welcome to you both. Okay, let's just say out loud, the president is on a roll, okay? Since the weekend, he has been tweeting up a storm. If he's not tweeting, he's giving these conferences, making these statements that has a lot of people scratching their heads and the administration trying to catch up with the statements he's making. Let's start with this whole thing of getting the military to the border. Let's give our viewers context. It has happened before. Right. We have seen under Obama and Bush the National Guard be deployed to the border. In the case of Bush, they were used to do rebuilding work and reconstruction work. Under Obama, it was more surveillance. Seema, do we know what the president wants them to do this time around, or if it's the National Guard?
Well, initially we didn't. From his remarks in the press conference, he just talked about the military heading to the border, which alarmed a lot of people, honestly, because we have a long history in this country, and it's in the law that you can't use the military to enforce domestic policy. You can't use that on American soil. But as you said, the National Guard has been deployed in situations like this, and exceptions have been made. For example, in 1992, when we had the riots in Los Angeles, the military was certainly deployed there. But the White House put out a statement later this evening, sort of clarifying it, which we've seen them do a number of times recently, saying that he's talking about the National Guard, which also raises other questions in terms of logistics, because one way to do it is to have the governors of the states affected deploy the National Guard. But in California, Jerry Brown, I'd be very, very surprised if he deployed the National Guard.
Does anything to the president.
Right, exactly. And then there are ways, though, for the federal government to do it, but it does involve some loops, but some complications, some regulations. But when the president spoke this afternoon in that press conference, he didn't talk about the National Guard. He just talked broadly about the military.
Peter, the president, since the weekend, has been again on this tear about the border. There are no border law. It's a crisis. There's drugs and crime and people pouring over the border. Is this more political messaging aimed at his base, or is this really a case of political implementation? Does he plan to actually do something, or is this just about the midterms coming up in November?
I think it's mostly for his political base. He wants to hang on to that small 35% that he has and maybe expand it a little bit, but he's trying to hold on to the base so he can win the midterm elections and keep the Republicans in place so he won't get impeached by the House. If the Democrats take over, that's a very good possibility, right? So he's offering some really amazing alternatives. He's saying, bring the military in? Are you kidding me? The Posse Comitatus Act, which you mentioned, of 1878, prevents that. They can only play a supporting role, and the National Guard usually use it this time. I think he's really playing up to his base mostly.
Do you think he knows that? Do you think he knows the limitation? Seema, you gave me a face there. But do you think he knows that?
I think it's sort of a combination of all of the above of what you mentioned. I mean, I think, first of all, he's reacting to this news that is being featured prominently on his favorite network, Fox News, of a caravan of people from Central America coming through Mexico heading towards the United States. So I think he's reacting viscerally to that.
And let's give our viewers context. This is an annual march, right? Where it's a human rights march that has migrants basically exemplifying the difficulties of making the journey.
I think there was some question about what the Mexican government was doing to perhaps halt their advance towards the,
yes.
So I think, it's a controversial issue. But it's been featured in certain parts of the media, and he's, I think some of his tweets over the weekend were actually like moments after you would see it on TV, he'd be tweeting. So I think that he is reacting to that viscerally, as he often does. But I also do think it's related to the base and the midterms, which are all connected, because let's not forget, during the 2016 campaign, his whole thing, I'm going to build this wall, I'm going to make Mexico pay for it. We aren't building the wall, and Mexico isn't paying for it. So if you have to answer to your base on that, if your base is disappointed that you haven't done anything on this, well, maybe sending the military, or saying you're going to send the military to the border, is one way to do that. And also, this is a popular issue among Republican voters, Republican base voters. So if you're trying to hang on to the House, this is one way that, this is an argument, one would think that Republicans could use to increase turnout.
Well, people on Capitol Hill, at least some of them, aren't happy at all. Right. Let me put up part of the statement by Representative Gallego. He had this to say. He's a Marine veteran, and in the statement he said that Trump's plan is an insult to our troops that would harm our military as an institution. Congress must stop this misguided scheme. Peter, if the president is indeed serious about this, getting the military, the National Guard to the border, in whatever context, do you expect this Congress to push back and push back hard?
This current Congress is Republican-dominated. They don't want to push anything with Mr. Trump. They're afraid of him. They're worried that they might lose their own home seat, the district seats in the midterms. I think he also confused the fact that those people coming up from Central America were political refugees. They were asylum seekers, as opposed to economic refugees that had come across the border to find jobs here. He either confused them or he didn't really want to make the difference.
Details.
Yeah, right, of course.
I want to switch gears and talk about Syria, also the U.S. military involved there. The president, again, this started with a speech he gave last week in Ohio, basically shocked everyone, at least on his military advisors team, by saying he wants U.S. troops to come home. Seema, I guess my question is, what is driving this, bearing in mind his military advisors have been very, very clear this fight is not over against ISIS?
I think this is something he talked about once again during the campaign, the idea that the United States is overly committed to helping other people in other regions of the world, that people in those regions sort of need to take responsibility for their future. The problem with ISIS is, first of all, while ISIS they've lost so much territory, the American military has been very successful in, in clawing back the land, they are still dug in a small part of Syria. And the fear, I think, among the military advisors is that if we leave, A, there'll be a vacuum where they could regain some power, or B, you have other nations like Turkey and Iran who have their own interests, who might try
Russia.
And Russia, I'm sorry, it's the biggest one and I'm leaving it out. But that might use that as an opportunity to sort of to focus on their own strategic priorities. So I think there are a lot of concerns among national security.
Let's take a listen to what the president said in the White House on Tuesday on this matter.
I want to get out. I want to bring our troops back home. I want to start rebuilding our nation. We will have, as of 3 months ago, $7 trillion in the Middle East over the last 17 years. We get nothing out of it. Nothing.
Peter, what I find interesting about what the president is saying with regards to the U.S. involvement in Syria is he frames the engagement as purely a cost, an economic cost to the U.S., and not at all when he speaks publicly about the national security gain to this country, in the sense that being involved in the fight against ISIS ultimately keeps America safe. That's just the reality of it. Why does he do that, or does he not understand that? I mean, I ask that without, trying to be cynical about it. I mean, what's going on here?
I think it goes along with America First agenda, and he has to tell these, right-wing populists that voted for him that #1 comes America. We're going to take care of our country. We're going to pull troops out of places that are not paying for their way. And he's not looking at the overall balance of power, sophisticated way of looking at the world, as most policymakers have been doing all these years. He's just completely way off from what other presidents have done or promoted in terms of our involvement in parts of the world. It doesn't have to always be militarily. It can be economically, it can be diplomatically. He doesn't want anything to do with that at all, usually speaking. He doesn't have finesse about his foreign policy. It's pretty heavy-handed.
I mean, Seema, this is the president who said during the campaign, and we have seen since, that he defers to his military advisors on all matters military. But this time he's going rogue.
Well, and he's making statements, but let's actually see what happens.
You make a good point.
And also, I mean, he's bringing in John Bolton as, his new national security advisor, I believe, and his views are very hawkish. And I mean, he was an architect of the Iraq War.
Indeed.
So I would like to see what his thoughts are on some of these issues.
It would not be a White House press opportunity without a question about Russia. Take a listen to what the president had to say.
I think I could have a very good relationship with President Putin. I think. It's possible I won't, and you will know about it. Believe me, this room will know about it before I know about it. It's a real possibility that I could have a good relationship. And remember this, getting along with Russia is a good thing. Getting along with China is a good thing. Getting along with other countries, including your 3 countries, is a good thing, not a bad thing. So I think I could have a very good relationship with Russia and with President Putin. And if I did, that would be a great thing. And there's also a great possibility that that won't happen. Who knows?
it is such a head scratcher every time he talks about Russia, because in that clip we just played, he talks about his relationship with Putin as if it's in a vacuum, you know, as if we don't have the backdrop as laid out by the intelligence agencies of Russia meddling in the US elections. It is truly fascinating, this dissonance on the part of the president and what he says, and sometimes what we hear out of his officials and his administration.
Right. Well, I mean, I think you see the administration actually taking a strong stance, and we just expelled, what, 60 Russian diplomats, basically, over the poisoning of a Russian in his daughter, right, in the UK. But yeah, you're absolutely right in that his words about about Putin are very different than his words about sort of the
everything else.
Yeah, and in fact, think of the audience he was speaking in front of. He was speaking with leaders from Eastern European countries who suffered under, for decades under Russian rule, who are really concerned about increased Russian aggression, particularly like after Russia, Crimea, exactly, a couple of years ago. So I thought the setting was really odd to make that statement. It also comes a couple weeks after the president called Putin and congratulated him on his re-election.
Do not congratulate him.
Especially when he was aides were like, do not congratulate him, and didn't bring up the fact that it basically, I mean, he was re-elected. The question of the fairness of the election is, I think, well.
Yes. Peter, what did you make of it? What did you make of the comments? I mean, he did say, no one's been tougher on Putin than I have. He was asked, is he a friend or a foe? It was kind of like this prevaricating. What do you make of it?
It's so inconsistent, you can't even understand where this president's coming from. On one hand, he wants to say, we want to be good friends with Russia. The other hand, he's expelling diplomats and trying to be a tough man with it. He needs to get a consistency and a visionary foreign policy that has principles on which it's based. And it's not the way he's doing it the way other presidents have done it, especially Barack Obama. I think it's time that, we get the president on the right track here on this foreign policy issue, especially with countries like Russia and with Syria.
So a lot of things this president does differently, Peter.
Oh,
I think we figured that out by now. Seema Mehta and Peter Mathews, a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.